I expect Mr. Connor McDavid to have a big series. I think you've seen it throughout the playoffs. There was a point we were talking early on in the playoffs. He only had 1 goal to show for, but that's changed. He's the leading point getter right now for the team. Of course, Zach Hyman has 14 goals leading the playoffs in goals. Leon Draisaitl's got 10. McDavid only 5. But after that just spectacular goal in Game 6 against the Dallas Stars, leading things off for the Oilers, of course, Zach Hyman ends up with the game winner. That's the ridiculousness we can see from Connor McDavid. The toe drag, backhand, top right corner. I'm going to say Connor McDavid scores 3+ goals. So that's my opinion. I think he's going to keep progressing as the playoffs go. And now we're in the Stanley Cup final and he has all the momentum to go for. So I think Connor McDavid 3+ goals is maybe a stretch, is maybe a hot take. I'm the host of Hot Take Hockey, so I'm laying it out there. I think after that confidence boost out of Game 6, the Oilers are really going to have to get their 5-on-5 production back to where they wanted. So I'm going to say Connor McDavid scores 3+ goals. I think that's fair, and I think that leads into my next segment of conversation here. Conn Smythe predictions, and I think the leaders right now are Matthew Tkachuk and Connor McDavid. So here's my perspective here. I think there's a lot of dark horses, and I'll get to that on the next section here of predictions. Matthew Tkachuk is just the all-time talent, whether it's physicality, whether it's getting under the team's skin, whether it's playmaking ability, whether it's scoring it around the net, playoff performing. I feel like we haven't really seen those big game winners from Matthew Tkachuk, and now he's going to go up against, I would say, some familiarity from his time with the Calgary Flames. So once upon a time, it was Battle of Alberta, always getting it going in the regular season, then leading into the playoffs. Matthew Tkachuk, of course, requested a trade out of Calgary, and then he joins the Florida Panthers, and now he gets to meet the Edmonton Oilers and Connor McDavid in the Stanley Cup Finals. So I do think these are the ultimate matchups here. I do think that when you look at the star players that really knock down the opposing team, Matthew Tkachuk, as much as the Rangers didn't want to talk about it, he was getting under the skin of a couple guys there. Igor Shesterkin kind of made a joke saying he didn't understand the trips that he was kind of laying out. But at the end of the day, Matthew Tkachuk is that guy for Florida. You could probably go down the list on a few other guys. Again, I'll talk about it in a second here. But Matthew Tkachuk leads the aspect of scoring in tough moments. But I would also say the other guy for me to look out for is Carter Verhaeghe. I mean, you go all the way to the back to last year. Carter Verhaeghe scored the Game 7 victory or game-winning goal against the Boston Bruins in round 1. So I think Verhaeghe, Tkachuk, and then we'll bring up the next graphic here. I really think Gustav Forsling has been another conversation, but on top of that, with the Florida Panthers, I feel like Alexander Barkov is somehow still underrated. So these are my 3 dark horse MVP picks, guys. I think after Tkachuk, after McDavid, you could easily talk about Alexander Barkov just as a complete player. I really do think that he's the guy that could shut down Connor McDavid. And I think at the end of the day, he could be a guy that scores big goals. Leon Draisaitl, in terms of a dark horse MVP, that's another conversation. So we'll pull up the next graphic. Gustav Forsling is the underrated one for leading ice time. I think that's kind of my conversation is how are you going to shut down Connor McDavid? Well, look what Gustav Forsling did in round 1 and 2 for the Florida Panthers, and then into the conference final. He's scoring big goals as well. So I think you're going to see a lot of ice time from Barkov. You're going to see a lot of ice time from Aaron Ekblad, who needs to improve because he just hasn't been there in my eyes. And then Gustav Forsling. So my prediction is Gustav Forsling will lead the ice time for the Florida Panthers. I think that's, if you talked about that like months or years ago, I think you'd probably be on the vibe of calling me crazy or calling anyone crazy. So at number 3 for Stanley Cup predictions, I'm saying Gustav Forsling leads ice time. And Bob's, so Barkov, Conn Smythe would feed generations, Eagle says. Like I said, I think he's a hot take for it. And I think that's not even that far-fetched. I think Matthew Tkachuk is kind of like the attractive, like the big time, like pick for Conn Smythe. But I think when you look at the Florida Panthers and you look at kind of role players here, I think Gustav Forsling and Alexander Barkov completely fit into my conversation because not only have they been producing, and Gustav Forsling producing with some goals, they've been a huge aspect for shutting down the top opponents. So I like the almighty comment in the chat saying don't sleep on Barkov, Bob, or Forsling on Florida's side for Conn Smythe. And there you go. So I'll put up number 4 on the Stanley Cup predictions on the board. I want to talk about both number 3 and number 4. But number 4, dark horse MVPs. Guys, get in the chat. Comment your thoughts. So I got Leon Draisaitl, Evan Bouchard, who's like basically on his way to breaking records as a defenseman in the playoffs for the Edmonton Oilers. He's already matched Cale Makar's 2022 playoff run point total. And I think that's insane. Like Evan Bouchard, 21 points in this playoff run. He's been ridiculous. So I think, and as Randy in the chat says, Edmonton a little leaky in the defensive side and in goal versus Florida here. Yeah, it's a concern. But this is where I'm talking about is Edmonton, they didn't even show their best in that game 6 against Dallas. They only had 10 shots on net, guys. That's crazy. That's a crazy conversation for the Edmonton Oilers. But when you look at Zach Hyman, who has scored 14 goals in this playoff run, you talk about Leon Draisaitl, who has scored 10 goals in this playoff run. They've put up those numbers. And then you have Connor McDavid. You go back to my top prediction on the board there. He's scoring 3+ goals in this final. He only has 5 goals. And yeah, that's not even bad. Like if you talk about a guy like say McDavid scores 1 goal in the final, like to have 6 goals, I would say McDavid's probably going to end up with 35+ points in this playoff run. You're not going to slander that. There's just no way. There's no way any competent person is slandering those numbers, right? But I do think McDavid is just going to gain that confidence going to the final, his first Stanley Cup final in his career. So I do think that when you're going through this conversation piece that I'm having here, it's like the star players and McDavid, Tkachuk, but there's also so many other role players that have played a huge part in both these teams getting here. And Gustav Forsling is for sure that. I do like what Bill McDonald says in the chat, and that's why I do think Gustav Forsling will be up there nice time, is that Paul Maurice is a very smart coach. He's a very experienced coach. I think when you look at Paul Maurice and what he's done with the Florida Panthers, they are not good on paper in terms of defensive. Their defensive squad. Like their forward group has been electric defensively, offensively across the board. Like you've got defensive players like leading the charge in an Alexander Barkov, but then you got other guys that have really pitched in, whether it's like a Luosterainen or a Lundell. Those depth guys have been huge for Florida to play a matchup game, which other teams just don't have. And that's my concern for Edmonton here, guys. As much as I think Edmonton could win the series and win a long series, I think the Florida Panthers have the opportunity to win a shorter series. So before I get that last graphic up on the board, I just want to say that Paul Maurice and the Florida Panthers, if they do it right and they find a way to shut down these 3 guys, Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Zach Hyman, this series could end very quickly. So I see 2 versions of this series, and I'm going to try to predict the more fun outcome here. I could see Sergei Bobrovsky playing very well. I could see Paul Maurice from on paper, and the game's not played on paper, this poor defensive group from what they constructed at the start of the year to being just a complete defensive group now with everything that they could possibly provide. Gustav Forsling, one of the most underrated 2-way defensemen in the game right now. Aaron Ekblad's got to improve, right? He showed the signs. He's made mistakes. He's got to really step up in this Stanley Cup final. Brandon Montour, again, you see the signs of the offensive, I would say, prowess. And then you talk about him being a pending UFA. Like these guys need contracts. Brandon Montour needs a contract. He is a pending UFA this offseason. And I think that's another aspect to look at is like, that's a guy that wants to prove himself in this final. So when you look at the Florida Panthers on paper defensively, they did not look good going into the season, but Paul Maurice has molded that defense group to be great. And then you look on the Oilers side of things, as Morgan's saying in the chat, Darnell Nurse's career was like being slandered across the board after Game 3 and certain games in that conference final. But now the Edmonton Oilers, with all those issues, with all the noise of Darnell Nurse and Evan Bouchard not being a complete defenseman and Stuart Skinner not being able to lead the charge, the Oilers' depth not being enough, well, they're here. They're in the Stanley Cup final. And that's why I have Evan Bouchard being an underrated dark horse MVP, being a dark horse Conn Smythe candidate, is because how much offense he's produced from the back end. He's done way more than any defenseman on the Florida Panthers offensively, right? As much as I'm giving Gustav Forsling his kudos, it's just been Evan Bouchard's show. And then, as I said, the Barkov matchups.